So before you were the artistic director of the Blah Blah Blahs in Leeds, you were actually artistic director of the Playhouse in Birmingham, and that's how we first met. I was wondering, in that time since we've seen one another, has your approach to making work for school audiences, young audiences, changed in any way?
Yes, yes, specifically for schools. I think it has changed, but it's changed kind of in response to environment. Um, so I think because of the situation with schools now, because it is much harder to be working almost exclusively for schools and with schools for a long time. I've been devising work or working with writers or whatever, but kind of thinking about audiences in different settings. So, kind of creating work that has the ability to cross over between schools, between community settings, and increasingly theatre venues as well. So, I think, there was a time where the devising was very specifically for schools and really having that deep knowledge of how schools worked and those really close relationships with teachers. But I think just by the nature of schools and the fact that it's so much more difficult now to work regularly with schools. So yeah, it has. But a lot of the processes, a lot of the kind of yeah, a lot of the processes haven't changed. I still work in a very collaborative way because why wouldn't you? You've got a room full of people who bring expertise and resources and experiences. Why wouldn't you use them? Why would you be autocratic about that? And that hasn't changed, and I can't see that changing ever, to be honest.
Great, that's really great to hear. And I was wondering how your company, the Blahs now, which are based in Leeds, how does the city of Leeds influence the work that you make?
That's a really interesting question. It's one that I was actually thinking about today because the Blahs have always had this sort of strong local profile. I mean, over the years, that sort of manifests in different ways. Historically, the company had a youth theatre, it had a very strong cohort of local schools that it connected with repeatedly, but yet the company has always had a national and international profile. So it's like how all of those pieces sit together. And I think we are sort of there again now, where we're looking at what's our local relationships, particularly when we're looking at kind of co-authorship. How are we building those sustained relationships with groups of children and young people? But we have an intention to tour nationally. And in the future, should the project be right, then, again, I think we would consider working internationally. So it's sort of how all of that really sits together. A project like Stirring Up the Past has a very strong Leeds focus, and isn't going to tour because it's site specific. A project like the Vulture Song, absolutely did and had its origins in an international collaboration. So I think, that's a live question really about how that all sits together and how it informs the work. So I don't think there's a sort of definitive answer on that. I think that's something that kind of gets reconfigured constantly.
Cool. Your most recent work, The Vultures Song, the audiences and the span of venues that work toured to, from schools to community centres to theatres. It was also written by Mike Kenny. So I was wondering, first of all, how did that collaboration come around with Mike, and how did that process of putting that show together take place? What did that look
Gosh,
like?
so the very beginnings of that project started in, now let me see if I can get this right, I think about 2015, if not a little bit earlier. And it started off just with the idea of creating something around partition because it was coming up for the 70th anniversary. And at the time, the Blahs had a relationship with a couple of schools in India and had gone out and done CPD with the teachers and taken work over there to tour into the schools. So there was basically those three ingredients. There was the idea of creating something around partition, there was the idea of a partnership with schools in India and in the UK, and there was a commitment from Mike to work as a writer in the process. And I had just joined the Blahs at the time, so I kind of inherited that, but that's all it was. It was just really those ideas. And then over a 3-year period, 2 to 3 year period, actually, it went through sort of various stages of development. So we were lucky enough to secure some R&D funding through an initiative, an Arts Council initiative or funding stream called Reimagine India, which was all about creating work for the anniversary of Indian independence, and of course shortly after that partition, because those two events kind of happened very close to one another. And that funded us to go and do 2 periods of R&D in India. Then subsequently we got some further funding to do another period of R&D in the UK. And at that stage the intention was still very much around creating work for schools. And Mike worked with us in that process and came out to India. We worked with Indian actors. We spent time in schools there. We did a lot of research with survivors of partition, that generation that really were very elderly at that stage and, you know, unfortunately were dying. So we spoke to people who had had that first-hand experience of displacement and all of the other things that came with partition. And then we, gosh, I mean, it was the sort of development, and this was, of course, so funding dependent that, you know, every stage of development was then precipitated, the next was precipitated by another round of fundraising. So there'd be pause, and then we got funding for the next bit, and then there'd be another pause. So I'm just kind of trying to think of the various different chapters in the process. And then we had, yes, so then Mike had developed the script, and we knew we were going to tour it into schools. But by that stage, the kind of explicit collaboration with India hadn't been possible. We hadn't got the funding for that. So in the first instance, we had decided that we would tour it to schools in the UK. But with the script having been developed, then it was there for the theatre company who we developed a partnership with, a company called Yellow Cat, who are based in Delhi. It was there for them to tour it when they had the means to do that, which didn't end up happening. I won't say ever won't happen, because, you know, there's still a possibility, and I still have a close relationship with the artistic director of Yellow Cat, so we've kind of sustained that relationship. So we then, and this was actually with funding from the Paul Hamlin Foundation, we toured into schools, but we toured it alongside the development of some digital resources, which was kind of where the participation of that piece resided, as opposed to explicitly being within the performance itself, which would be the sort of modus operandus of the BLAS previously, that we would create a piece of participatory theatre. Whereas this time, even though we were creating it for schools, we were sort of under pressure to start to work with larger audiences, which started to make that participatory work more difficult. So we were exploring new ways of engaging our audiences in the questions and the themes and the issues of the piece. And we looked to kind of trial doing that through a set of digital resources that sat alongside the performance. We developed those in partnership with C&T. And we worked alongside a cohort of teachers who were almost like a kind of focus group for this. And we carried out research into it to the extent to which they could use the resources to really continue work in the classroom. So that's kind of where we did our schools tour. And like I said, it was part of a bigger package of activity funded by Paul Hamlin. Then we got another piece of funding, and this was at the time when the BLAS unfortunately lost their MPO status. So we were a national portfolio organisation till the last round, and then we lost our funding. So as a part of the project funding that we received after coming out of MPO, we looked to how we might broaden our audiences, because we were aware that schools work was really dropping off. And so we had some money to tour to a few community settings. Then the kind of final chapter of it was this year, where we had funding to tour the Vulture's Song to theatre venues. And really that was about us really starting to develop our venue relationships, to look at that sort of repositioning of the company to become a small-scale touring company. And as you say, that was the activity that was unfortunately cut short by COVID. So that's a kind of very long-winded gallop through several years of development of a piece that kind of had multiple intentions and worked across, different audiences and different settings. So a really kind of key developmental piece for us.
Yeah, and what a shame for the tour to be cut short. So you obviously must feel then that throughout the developmental process that the piece had gone on, that unfortunately for those small theatre audiences, they were missing out on the show or the project in its absolute best form. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. It was a bitter disappointment. I think there was a kind of, what's the word? There was a buzz around it. There was, because we had done those previous tours, we had the responses of audiences. We were going into that conversation with venues, with the benefit of those 2 tours behind us, on a really practical level. It had allowed us to create kind of really good quality promotional materials, but we had those qualitative audience responses that we could say, this is what our audiences are saying in response to this work. And we had done 2 performances, so we were in the really early stages of the tour, and we'd had really, really positive feedback from the audiences, and really good feedback mechanisms as well. So it just it was the beginning of, yes, the tour, but a bigger conversation and beginning to establish those relationships and our reputation as a company that also toured to theatre venues and could still in those settings engage schools audiences. So one of the settings that we performed to did engage local schools. That was the audience that they drew in, and drawing on the resources that we had that were sitting around the performance and the expertise that we had, and obviously their established relationships. So it really felt like it was the beginning of something very exciting, and to have it cut short at such a critical stage sort of felt just really difficult for us. And of course, we don't know when that small scale touring sector is going to kind of be able to get back off its knees again, and we don't know what shape it will be. So it sort of feels that was a moment of opportunity, and we don't know when that will come again, because nobody does.
No. However, from the outside looking in, the rich development that the Vultured song had gone through left you incredibly well prepared for the unexpected. You have all of the learning resources for the show available online, and those learning resources are not just for schools or young people, but also families as well. The full performance of the show is available to view on YouTube. So all of that digital wraparound, regardless of the unexpected, was certainly all there ready to go.
I know it was, and I think that was really interesting, because obviously when the cancellations happened, us, like many other companies, we instantly responded by going, well, what can we make accessible? And the resources that wrapped around the performance were always there to be available for free for anybody, really, because it's accessible through the website. But it was something that was signposted for our schools audiences and for our family audiences. So we'd developed those, and I think that draws on our kind of applied theatre origins, if you like. That idea that you're not just offering a in the moment experience, which you are, but you're offering something that allows you to extend and deepen the conversations coming out of the work. And also, the Vulture song draws on some very sensitive and difficult issues and events. So there's a responsibility actually to provide support to enable those conversations to continue. And we've always taken that responsibility sort of very seriously. But yeah, you're right. So then it was like, well, we can make these draw people's attention to the fact that this is available. But the one thing that we did do, like you say, was we then made a recording of the performance available on YouTube. Under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have done that, because that wasn't recorded It was recorded for internal purposes. It was more a record or a rehearsal guide. But it just felt like the times were so exceptional that actually, and there was a tolerance perhaps for material being out there that wasn't sort of national theatre streaming quality. People were just hungry for digital content, be that for home learning or, and so for us it was a kind of first line response, really. Let's make as much of this accessible as we possibly can. Yeah, and we had the highest ever levels of engagement with any of the resources that we'd ever put out. I think in a 4-month period there was like 3,000 views on YouTube, and that's the level of engagement we would never previously have got. But I think it's absolutely opened the door now for everybody to really consider what a digital offer is, because this isn't going anywhere. There's things to be learned from this. And I think there was that initial response that we were a part of, which was a kind of sort of putting stuff out online digitally, responding in the moment to the crisis and the immediacy of the crisis. And now what I think you see a lot of companies doing, us as well, is to really think very deeply about what is the nature of our digital offer and what are we wanting to do through that, and how do we need to upskill in order to meet that. So now it's more considered. That was an immediate response. Now it's in that kind of, considered terrain, more strategic.
Yeah. Could I ask, in regards to the themes of the Vultures song, which for a show that is for young audiences, the themes of the show could actually be perceived as being quite dark or difficult to approach with young people. You've got themes of partition, displacement, fractured communities, loss, exile. How did the young people react to the show?
Do you know what was really interesting about this was we had a number of audiences where a lot of those things that you've mentioned, particularly being displaced, some young people who were from refugee and migrant backgrounds. So we had a significant number of audience members who had lived experience of those things. And they spoke very positively about seeing that some of that stuff reflected back and the framing of it. Because, Mike Kenny is a master storyteller, obviously, that goes without saying. And his kind of very careful framing and the kind of, interposing between lightness and dark, humour and kind of, really difficult territory. And of course, the use of the storytelling vultures as a sort of a distancing device, and the sort of and the playfulness and the grotesquerie that comes with that. So that very careful sort of protection mechanisms that are built into the storytelling. And the young people who experienced the piece, for whom those issues sort of resonated, only spoke positively about it. And in some instances we had, this really blew me away. We had one audience in a school, and at the end of it the teacher came up and said, "This is amazing. I've taught that girl for 2 years, and she came and she told me that both of her parents were killed. And I knew that she was a refugee, but both of her parents were killed. And I didn't know that about her, and she's never shared that with anybody." So, those kind of really profound moments of connection actually with audiences. Again, we had a refugee theatre company that came to see it, and for them it enabled them to have some of those conversations that aren't easy, that are really, really tough. And also you would have had audiences for whom they've never had lived experience of this, and then they're engaging with things sort of differently. So I have to say we didn't have any kind of negative responses to that. It was only really positive in terms of opening up conversations and understandings. And we had one audience where the audience members were predominantly Indian heritage, and again some of the people in the audience had lived connections to partition, mainly through their parents. And that audience stayed afterwards and talked just, with one another for ages about it. And it was a big kind of extended family group, but again, it had kind of sparked memories and, so I think there's a real power to connect, but also to protect.
Yeah, and that connection comes through the beautifully woven universal themes that are explored through the narrative also
Yeah,
as
and
well,
that was
right?
a really, really early intention. We knew sort of in the very earliest stages of development that we didn't want to do a play about partition. We knew that we wanted to tell a universal story that would draw on some of the stories and experiences of partition. And of course, some people would come to it and they would kind of overlay their own experiences to read it as partition. But most of our young audiences had no knowledge or experience of partition. So that wasn't in their, if you like, kind of projected reality that they put onto it. They read it really multifariously, and we deliberately wanted to do that. We wanted it to resonate differently with different audiences. And, for some of our young audiences, it became about the basics of difference, and how you treat people who are different from you. That was, and that was what they drew from that kind of, the universal kind of nature of the storytelling. And we very deliberately wanted to do that. And we want, no, and we wanted it to be playful. We knew that from the very beginning as well.
So did that feedback from those young audiences then help to shape the SMSC research that was funded through the Paul Hamlin Foundation?
That came a little later, actually. I think it came explicitly a little later, but I think that as a kind of question or an inquiry had been sitting over the BLAS work for a long time. And that had been this kind of perennial question around where work of this nature fits into curriculum. And, for a very long time, I think, we had a sense of the BLAS work having more of a lateral connection to curriculum as opposed to instrumental. So as opposed to saying, we will do this part of the curriculum for you, it was much more, we will open up these kinds of conversations. And so for a long time, there'd been a sense really that SMSC, and prior to that, PHSE, was sort of where the work could connect meaningfully to. And then that began, I think, through the first year or so of developing that began to crystallize maybe into a clearer question. And then really when we started to look at the sort of development of the piece, but also pragmatically how you fund the development of the piece, and then how whoever you're approaching for funding, the alignment of their criteria with your intentions, then it started to emerge as, well, actually, we have the opportunity here to do a sustained piece of research that actually tracks teachers working over a year in the end, and that's what it ended up being. So I think, there was a sort of an emergence and a crystallization of a question that had sat over the work for a long time.
Mm. And is taking that lateral approach how the BLAS plan to continue to work? These are the topics, themes that we're interested in, and then through exploring them or working, collaborating with teachers, then begins to open them up for discussions with young people.
Yeah, I think in terms of schools, that's very much where the relationship sits. It does sit with those areas of the curriculum that enable the opening up of a space for conversation. And I think in terms of how we view the work and the kind of stories we want to tell and the kind of work we want to make, it is about exploring those questions and issues that matter to children and young people in the world today. I think that probably what is shifting for the company is that question about how we involve children and young people as co-authors in our work more. So previously we've kind of tacitly built on understandings of where they're at in the world, and we've built on that previously through spending time in schools with them and sometimes repeatedly visiting schools. Because that picture's shifting now, and because we haven't got those sustained relationships with schools now, it's actually, the question is, how do we more explicitly involve children and young people in the early development of work as in a co-author role, really? And I think longer term, the question is, how do we kind of discover the sort of interests and questions that they have pre-developing project ideas. So, you know, that's a very live area for us. But certainly in terms of schools work, it is very much around those areas of the curriculum that we'd seek to make connections to, yeah.
Yeah. And from this research, what methodologies are you beginning to cultivate? Like, what do these conversations look like when working co-collaboratively with teachers and
I mean,
students?
we're not, in terms of the sort of pre-development of projects, we're not having those conversations at the moment, but what we are trialling, and we're just applying for some funding for 3 lots of R&D activity that will run simultaneously. And in that, we're going to be trialling work in schools and nursery settings, because we're talking about working with very young children on one of the project, and then older children on another of the project. So we're looking at, in the very, very early stages of developing project ideas, actually going to them with the material, with the questions, with some of the form that we're interested in exploring, and actually playing, really, you know, having playful workshops where we're quite open. We have clear questions, but we're open in terms of the responses, and then really looking at how their responses can inform then work that takes place in the studio in a more traditional R&D. So we're actually just literally last week have submitted for some Arts Council funding to support that, and that's really about co-authorship.
Yeah, that's really exciting.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
working co-creatively with pupils and teachers produces such exciting and organic processes and eventually materials to work
Yeah,
with.
absolutely. And I think, you know, we've, in the past, like I say, we've relied on that sustained relationships with schools and regularly working with teachers who are kind of the gatekeepers to children. And that was the way that we were kind of accessing, you know, sort of the origins or the conversations that would allow us to sort of shape up projects. But because that is now largely severed, you know, it's kind of looking at, well, how do we do this differently? Yeah.
So I saw on your website that you're currently R&D in a new show, Stirring Up the Past, which looks
Yeah.
incredibly exciting because you are once again creating site-specific work with and in national heritage sites in Leeds. So how did this project come about? How's it all going?
Yes, so we had our first online teacher session last week. So again, this has been another project, and I think that there's something interesting in just saying this. A long gestation of projects, time to really build meaningful partnerships, you know, and that's sat with the Vulture song, and it sits with Stirring Up the Past, because the conversations for this project started about 3 years ago. um, with Leeds Museums, and specifically with the Discovery Centre, which is an amazing space. It's a storage facility for over 1 million eclectic artefacts. You know, it's a high-tech, climate-controlled, light-controlled environment, and then you walk in and it is just this kind of Aladdin's Cove of amazing ephemera. And I was really lucky, really early in the process, to see a couple of school groups go into that space, and just to watch children's responses, and just to watch what they noticed and what they picked out. And, you know, just to see their kind of, it's an overused expression, but their awe and wonder at that place, and the questions that they had about it as well, was brilliant. And just to kind of go, this is an exciting space for kids. Yes, we should absolutely be making some work here. But I think, you know, history kind of holds everything that we are as human beings. You know, if you look to history, there's every story and experience that's ever been told, and and great history is about great storytelling, and the story changes depending on who's telling it. So, you know, there's a massive affinity with theatre there. And very often these places are very kind of theatrical spaces as well. When you're creating site-specific work, I think you've got to be very careful about the stimulus that you're bringing, or the offer you're bringing, the theatre offer, and really kind of being very careful about that, how that sits with the offer of that space and the things within it. So the beginnings of this, oh goodness, I think the sort of starting point of it was around telling marginalised stories. So telling some of those stories that are often sidelined in history. And at the time, the museum was doing a lot of work around the centenary of the First World War. So it was about kind of surfacing some of those stories of the Black and Asian soldiers that tended to get more sidelined. When we think about that time, when we think about the kind of people who were on the battlefields and fighting that war. So it was obviously, museums are full of amazing experts, who are fully aware of the kind of collections that they hold and the stories that those collections tell, and the need to kind of explore that from multiple points of view. So it was very fertile ground really to have those conversations. But we kind of just felt that as a theatre company, what we could bring to that is we could bring immersive and experiential storytelling. We could, allow the children to step into the world conjured by those artifacts, or meet the people associated with them, and bring those stories really compellingly to life. And through doing that, we could kind of provoke questions around history and our conceived notions of history, largely being about dead white men. We could reframe that, we could challenge that. And of course, now there's the whole sort of post-colonial lens that's being applied to a lot of collections, and looking at those artifacts acquired during the colonial times and looking again at the stories that are being told. So it really sat within that territory, that kind of work that is being done by museums and curators. And that was kind of really the early set of intentions. And then over time, again, with funding and the ability to do some R&D, so we did. Last year we did some R&D where we dug deeper into the collections and sort of spent time speaking to the curators and surfacing some of those stories. And we took some of that early stuff into schools to really find where children were orientating in terms of that, to sort of guide us. And we were going to be doing a site-specific performance now. So that was the timeline. And again, we were going to be creating digital resources that would sit alongside that to accompany the performance and to extend the performance. Obviously, that's changed. So we've kind of renegotiated the activity with the funding that we had already secured. So now what we're doing, and we're in the midst of this, is we are doing, we're working on the resources, but as almost a standalone piece. And we've brought greater resources to those. And this is also partly us kind of, I guess, experimenting with and exploring what is our digital offer. So we've got resources of a writer, a filmmaker, and 4 actors. And we're actually going to be creating filmed and audio content at the heart of these resources. And then around that would be activities that will link to the classroom. I mean, these resources are mainly devised for teachers to use. Hence, the teacher meeting last week, as we're working with a small cohort of teachers to inform the development of the classroom activities sitting around that. So that's where we are. We're still hoping that we will be able to do the site-specific performance, but in a year's time. And that kind of will be slightly different content, same intentions and aims, but slightly different content featuring different artifacts, different characters emerging through a crack in time. That's kind of the basic premise of it.
Yeah, and hopefully a year from now, then yourself and those young people can visit the site and this work can take place.
Yeah. And connecting it to those children and young people in some shape or form, sort of building a relationship and, kind of addressing those issues of identity and place, and actually finding a way of exploring that where you're kind of cracking open that idea of who 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 does, in our instance, who does Leeds belong to? Well, it belongs to all of us, because look at these stories. They are interconnected and they are global, and they always have been. So everybody has a connection to these things and this place and this city, that these things have kind of contributed to the industrial and the cultural and the social life of. So, that's the stuff that we were really sort of interested in doing, in really enabling those collections to speak to all of those children in those classrooms that are very often diverse and multilingual, and look, so are these collections, and look, so is Leeds' sort of relationship to these collections. One of the curators put it in a really lovely, succinct way and said, this museum tells the story of Leeds going out into the world and the world coming back to Leeds. And, I kind of think you could apply that to things other than objects as well.
Yeah, sure. Is the site actually open to the general public, Deborah?
Well, I mean, Leeds Museums sits across multiple sites, and they are open to the public under normal circumstances. Obviously, not right now at the moment in national lockdown, but they are. The Discovery Centre is. They do have events that public can attend. And so it's not kind of open on a day-to-day basis. It's a place of storage, research, conservation, really vibrant, busy hub. And, there are events where the public can come in. So school groups visit, they have open days and they have specific activities. So yes, it is accessible. Yeah.
And how have teachers responded to your R&D CPD sessions?
It was really interesting, because I was really, I guess, concerned that given the pressure that schools are under at the moment, that we wouldn't have particularly high attendance. We were asking teachers to come at the end of a day. They're sort of managing multiple demands at the moment. And so I kind of thought, gosh, are we going to get anybody coming? We had 8 teachers come, which at the moment is pretty good, I think. Yeah. And, a lot of them were saying, despite the challenges that we're facing, we really want to be able to kind of enrich our teaching with interesting and diverse learning materials. And that's why we want to be a part of this. There's a couple more teachers who will probably come to the next one who couldn't because of various circumstances attend. So, if we have a sort of steady group of 10, then, I'm quite happy with that under the circumstances, really. But I mean, once those resources are developed, they will be accessible for free on a site that has over 80,000 hits a year, so they'll be used. And we'll make them kind of high quality and relevant. That's very much the reason why we want to involve teachers, is that we want them to be used.
Yeah. Could I ask, how do your cultural heritage partners in Leeds respond to your passion to collaborate? Are they supportive?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, like I say, in terms of any partnerships, that we don't rush a partnership. It's something that we really take our time to, because you have to. I think for partnerships to have a chance of being successful and to be mutually meaningful and have value, you have to take time to negotiate them, and particularly when they're partnerships across sectors, because museums have a whole set of methodologies and expertise that we as a theatre company don't. There's a lot of alignments, but there's a lot of stuff that is very different expertise, and vice versa. And you have to take time to understand that and to negotiate some of that. So a really interesting one is the idea of, as a theatre company, we would be very comfortable with taking a historical event or even historical figures and to some degree fictionalizing them, because it's within the context and it's clearly framed as a fictional experience. If you are a curator, then that can be problematic. Yes, there's interpretation, but if you're actually taking somebody who existed and you are inventing events and ascribing it to that person, then you can start to be in ethical territory that's a little bit problematic in terms of what's truth, what's historical fact. So, we've had to have careful conversations around, we will carefully frame that, and because also these are digital resources, they're not happening live. So we're not able to actually do that careful framing or contracting into the experience as we would do in a live encounter. So we're having to look at ways of how we would do that digitally, what would sit around those resources to kind of underline that this is based on this real event. Here's the information about it. This is now an imagined version of that, and you can engage with it in these ways. So, really taking the time to kind of tease out or for those issues to surface and to take the time to work on them so that you have mutual trust and understanding of the expertise that the other party brings. And you can't do that stuff quickly.
No, I'm sure that you can't. And what a great end result is that these partnerships and the collaborative nature of your relationship with your partners ends up supporting and allowing these collaborative artistic projects to eventually flourish and continue to take place, which, as you say, takes time and also the expertise across all sectors to bring it all together. It's really exciting to hear you speak about that and to hear somebody talking about how these partnerships are formulated and executed.
And it's exciting, it's stimulating, and I think it you would hope then that kind of quality and depth and rigor to the process will ensure some degree of longevity for it. And I'd prefer to work in that way than something that is, of course, there are situations where you have to be really responsive and, respond to an opportunity. And, everyone will, and pragmatically, sometimes you have to work in those ways, and there's opportunities to work in those ways. Over the summer, we came together with a number of other theatre companies and we did a day of outdoor performances. That was incredibly responsive. It was in communities where there were high levels of digital poverty. So we were able to engage families who just weren't having any kind of cultural access at all. And that was really quick and responsive and, had huge value. And that's great. So this doesn't sort of... there are times where there's a good reason to work in that way, but actually in terms of developing partnerships that have, like I say, some sense of longevity, I'd really prefer to work in a way that allows that to develop over time. And gosh, there's a real tension there in a funding, what would the word be? An environment where funding is difficult to come by. There is a real tension where you're looking to develop projects and partnerships over a period of time, because of course that requires resourcing and, that requires relationships with funders. It requires a clear articulation of process. It requires reputation around quality work. So it comes out of all of those things, which when you're starting out, you don't have that as kind of capital, if you like, to use, to draw on. So, I get that that's not something that is available to everybody. And, sometimes it's not available to us either because we don't get the funding.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it goes back to what you were speaking on earlier in regards to forging pathways and making partnerships that are long lasting. You also teach at LIPA as well, Deborah, am I right, on the Applied Theatre undergraduate programme? It's the Theatre and Education module that you teach. And I was wondering, what skills do you explore with new undergraduate applied students to equip them once they graduate to begin making theatre and education?
I think I'm very lucky with that module because they're second year students and they have already had a really good foundation in a lot of the sort of practices or methodology that I would want to be working with them to use. So I'm not starting from square one with them. They've already had experience of creating applied theatre, not necessarily to take out to audiences. I think this is the first time that they actually go out of university and they work with a specific community. So, of course, that brings with it a huge amount of trepidation for them. So there's a lot of managing nerves and building resilience and all of that. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I've taught a number of TIE modules over the years now, and I think I've kind of learnt by trial and error. I'm probably making a lot of mistakes about the best way to sort of distill the practice. So I guess what I kind of start off with is I start by looking at some key theatre and education texts from kind of well-regarded theatre and education companies that they get to play out, but also to deconstruct. And in deconstructing, they're starting to kind of unpick what is sitting behind the audience engagement, the framing of the audience, the sort of modes of storytelling. But also I have kind of come to sort of codify some of the practice, drawing on theory. So I tend to work with Tony Jackson's he codes it into sort of 7 different modes. And I tend to kind of use frameworks like that as a starting point with the students, just as a way really of almost providing a framework or a taxonomy, or that we can hang stuff off and then they can begin to kind of embed it in their practical work. So really for the first pretty much half of the course, because I teach over an entire term, but I think for the first half of the course, it's very much about establishing some of those sort of foundational principles with them and actually holding them back from devising. There's a point in the middle where they're starting to get very anxious because they're kind of seeing that tour schedule and they're going, but we haven't started devising yet. And I'm like, yes, just hold on. It's fine. You'll be fine. You just really need to become very familiar with these because this will speed up your devising process. And within that, then, it's kind of laying some really clear parameters for how they're going to engage their audience and what they're facilitating, the basis on which they're making work. Because if they're going in to create a great piece of storytelling and then they've got no entry points for the young people and they don't know the questions that they're asking, it's like we know with applied theatre practice, it's absolutely about those kind of performance and those participatory elements evolving hand in hand with a clear sense of intentionality and purpose and a clear sense of your audience and what you're asking of them. So, I do really take time to kind of instill and explore and for them to own that stuff before they start their devising process. And then, over the years, I've kind of worked with different content. Sometimes it's been drawing on projects that are live for me because then I can bring a lot of stimulus materials into the studio. So I think the first time I worked at LIPA, we worked with partition materials because obviously I was in the midst of devising the Vulture song, and so there was a lot of stuff to hand that I could share with them. Whereas last time, actually, it drew much more on the interests of the group. It was a group that were, and I knew this from the course director, it was a group that were real kind of passionate activists. They were out there. They were kind of, they were wanting to make work that sort of inspired people to make actual change. And so I sort of used that as a starting point, and we looked to some historical change makers or activists that had an association with Liverpool, and they used that as their starting point then to open up conversations with the young people that they were going to be working with around ideas of activism. So that was kind of the starting point for content, was very much the sort of the group itself. So yeah, I think there's always new things that come out, and there's always things that send me back to the drawing board, and opportunities or tweaks or revelations that you have. It's never a kind of I don't have my module fixed and I pop it on the shelf and dust it off the next year. It's something that I'm kind of always revisiting depending on what the group bring to the process.
Yeah, sure. And how does the learning relationship between yourself and the undergraduates also begin to challenge and benefit you as a theatre practitioner as well?
It very much does, because I'm going into that, I'm going into that process, yes, as somebody who's teaching that module, but also as an applied theatre practitioner myself. So, that's a two-way process. And very often I'll say to them, I have a toolkit and a set of experiences I can share with you, but I don't have all of the answers. And some of the things that you're wrangling with is stuff I still wrangle with, So I think, there's always learning where you're kind of then reflecting back on what you do. Or sometimes to explain something, you need to distill it, and that can bring a greater level of awareness around it. You're having to articulate it, and in order to articulate it, you're having to understand it for yourself. So, and I think that sort of codifying practice was really useful for me, because it made me kind of go, oh, that's what we do when we're working with young people, and that's what's happening when we're facilitating that. So it was helpful to kind of just have those insights, which evolve. They evolve all the time. I think there's a whole load of questions that are thrown up for me as a director or a deviser. Now that work is not explicitly participatory, I've got a whole load of questions around the feedback loop with the audience, which are unresolved. So there's always going to be questions that sit over any work that you do.
What do you think are some of the biggest challenges that undergraduate applied theatre students face when beginning to understand and develop their own practice within this area?
Do you know what I think the biggest challenge is around the opportunity to actually do this work beyond university. I think that is the biggest challenge, because I think so many of those groups that we would normally be working with, be that a group of students in a school, be that through a youth theatre setting, be that through organised youth groups, so many of those have absolutely been stripped of their funding and their resources and barely exist anymore. So I think the opportunities to actually carry out this work in the first place are just severely limited now. And I think that's the biggest challenge, that, you have these students who have spent 3 years working incredibly hard and doing really exciting projects with the support of the university, through the networks and the contacts, using the resources of the university, and then they leave, and it's really, really tough for them to continue that work and to establish and set something up for themselves, because we're just in a really resource poor environment for applied theatre work. And I think that's the biggest challenge, and consequently you're having to manage expectations, but in a way that absolutely doesn't crush their zeal and their desire to work in this way, because perhaps they have answers that those of us who have been in the sector for a long time don't, because they're coming into it and seeing new opportunities. So you kind of want to go, this isn't going to be easy, but do it anyway. And, and I do find that a really sort of challenging aspect of my teaching, because I don't want to be coming in and being really cynical, but at the same time, I also do want to kind of prepare the students for the world that they're going to be entering into, and also to kind of, to really bring home the skill set that's going to be required to survive. And it isn't enough to just be a brilliant practitioner. You do have to be, that overused term of entrepreneurial, and you really have to kind of seek out your opportunities and be able to be well networked, and to seek out your partnerships and to find ways of working with little resourcing, which often is about asset sharing. You have to be able to do all of that, as well as being or working to being a really great practitioner.
Are there any applied academic options for young people in Leeds? Are there any applied courses?
Yeah, there is. Yeah, and I have done some teaching at Leeds over the years. Again, sort of, very much within the spectrum of applied theatre work. I'm just trying to think. The last time I worked there, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago. Well, I was offered some further teaching there, but BLAS commitments. This is the other thing as well, is kind of juggling those different commitments. I mean, that's very familiar to anybody who has any kind of freelance practice to their career, that whole tessellation of making projects fit together, and sometimes you just can't. But yes, there is a sort of a strong strand of applied theatre sort of work and practice that's happening. I mean, at the moment, I think the sort of higher education landscape looks very different, particularly on those practical courses, than it would do under normal circumstances, because, that inability to get together in a shared physical space and make work. So the teaching opportunities are less. And also, like everywhere else, they're under financial pressure. So, there's a whole particular set of challenges that this pandemic has brought to every sector. But
yeah. So do you encourage undergraduates to pursue a specific path within the applied arts, or I don't know, do you kind of leave that open and share your own journey and say, take from it what you will?
I think in the true spirit of being a facilitator, it's about kind of equipping them with, full knowledge and supporting them to make the decisions that are right for them, and their kind of aspirations. And, certainly the teaching at LIPA, it sits within a wider programme of study where it's very, very much about that. It's a very practical course, but it's a course that absolutely supports them to make their decisions by the end of it about where their interests lie and how they want to kind of realise them, really. So I'm a very small cog in a much bigger machine.
Yeah. I'm also really excited, Deborah, to get the opportunity to talk to you about something brand new, which is a new project that you're currently working on called Guerrilla Gardening. And you sent me over the project brief. And it's another piece of work which is applicable for not only communities and theatre audiences within Leeds, but also looks as though it's diverting itself towards a more national profile as well. How's that all going?
Absolutely, and that's a really good one to kind of cite as an example, because that's a piece we're hoping it is going to go into R&D. That kind of speaks to a lot of the things that we've spoken about, actually, because it is about cross-sector partnerships. So we're looking to work with organisations whose remit is around growing and outdoor environments. So a couple of organisations, Incredible Edible and Trees for Cities. And it's very much about developing those partnerships locally to inform work, as well as working with children in local schools to develop the material in its early stages. but the intention for that piece is that it will tour, and those organisations and their national networks will then kind of help us to devise and develop the wraparound activities around the piece. And, you know, like you say, there's a growing theme to the storytelling, as well as sort of other elements threaded through that around social isolation, food poverty, held hopefully in a really delightful and engaging story as well. But yes, so that kind of speaks to a lot of the things that we've covered in this conversation.
And how did the idea for guerrilla gardening come about? Where did that whole idea come from?
That, do you know what, that was very the sort of seeds of that seed gardening metaphor was in lockdown, and it was how so many people had found kind of solace in being outdoors, and people who weren't usually accessing the outdoors. So we live on the edge of Bradford, and so we can access the countryside sort of very easily, and the city, you know. But we saw, you know, our area was deluged with people who normally wouldn't be coming out, and kind of just taking, well, like I say, solace in the outdoors. And that idea of gardening, a lot of people, myself included, you know, kind of took to their gardens. And it wasn't just about, oh, we can't do anything else, we'll do this. It was in part about making sense of all of this uncertainty, by putting your hands in the soil, by growing something, the certainty of that. And then also sort of conversations around inner city schools and how a lot of children don't have easy access to green spaces and are very disconnected with the origins of their food and where their food comes from. And when I was living in inner city Birmingham, you know, I had sort of direct experience of that with the children who lived in the same avenue as me. It's sort of an area of high density housing, lots of kids who just, you know, the park down the road was their green space and was heavily used, but their connection to kind of the outdoor environment was absent, to the point where I remember the one tree in our avenue was cut down, and when I came back from work and said, what's happened to the tree? And the kids said, oh, it's gone, it was dirty. So that kind of relationship to nature for those children was really difficult. And also the whole kind of campaigning around food poverty. So I think it was a confluence of all of those things, really. And then from those beginnings, starting to have conversations and find those sort of crossover in interest with organisations, and kind of find the need, really, and sort of discover that, yes, there is a need for storytelling that deals with this stuff and deals with kind of growing as activism, but also community building activity, also a way of communities taking agency in addressing issues around food poverty, also connecting and providing children in inner city environments with opportunities to connect to green spaces and classrooms to be taken outdoors. So really all of that stuff coming together, I think.
And what's the remaining timeline for the project? Where are you now within the process?
So we're fundraising, so we've just submitted bids. If we're successful with that, then early in the new year, we'll spend some time really solidifying those partnerships, and going and spending time with those growing communities, partly as kind of research and partly, like I say, as kind of cementing the partnerships. We'll also take work into schools, very early ideas, hopefully with a small cohort of Bradford schools who are part of an initiative called Edible Playgrounds. So they're setting up growing spaces in their playgrounds. And then early summer, we'll have some time in the studio working with a dramaturg, a couple of actors, and an automata artist consultant to explore kind of elements, mechanical elements, using found objects. So that will be informed by sort of all of the work that we're doing with growing communities and with children. Then really depending on where that's at and sort of conversations running alongside that with potential venues, I think we'd be looking at touring into 2022. But obviously that's all contingent on what's going to be happening with the kind of touring landscape.
And is that certainly a definite aspiration now for the BLAS and the project to expand into those national waters?
Yeah, I think so. At the moment, that's an aspiration, but I think, we need to kind of have those conversations as to where this goes, who this engages, and how we engage them. I mean, the intention would be that we would create a performance that could sit across community settings and theatre venues, and that our partners would work with us to create other engagement activity to kind of complement, extend and enhance the experience of the performance. But I think, we really need to kind of have that conversation more deeply to see what that looks like and who engages. Yeah. I mean, they have those organisations that I mentioned, they have their own national networks, and national touring is, part of our kind of strategic intentions. So there's a definite compatibility. So one of the things I probably should have mentioned earlier was that during the lockdown period, we commissioned a piece of research which was very much looking at the touring ecology, specifically looking at older children. But, a lot of that kind of has given us intelligence to think about our national touring profile, which, by the way, that research is available for anybody to access. So if anybody's listening to this and they are interested, they do get in touch with me. I'm happy to share it.
And are you hopeful that we will see the Vultures song returning to touring again in 2021, maybe 2022? What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say no. I think that that's all possible. I think we're sort of in that process now. Once we start to know what the touring ecology looks like, then it will be, we'll be looking at our sort of strategic planning over the next sort of 3-4 years or so. So it's entirely possible that could, because that didn't really have a chance to tour to those settings, those theatre settings. That was incomplete. So there is the possibility of looking at touring that again.
So 2021 sounds like it's shaping up to be a really important and exciting year for the BLAS. Do you have any other plans, any other big things on the kind of tick list that the BLAS are hoping to achieve, or directions that you're hoping to head in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we've got another couple of potential partnerships that we're fundraising for, that were part of the bid that we've recently submitted, and again are part of our sort of our future plans. So we have a partnership with Utopia Theatre that we're hoping to develop. And Utopia Theatre are a company that explore African stories, or stories from and for the African diaspora. They're a resident company at Sheffield Theatres. Their artistic director, Mojisola, is a British Nigerian woman, and they kind of synthesize Western and African theatre forms. So we're kind of in the early stages of exploring a potential co-production with them, which is around a series of stories that are published stories about a character called Anna Hibiscus. So that's a kind of very early stage potential collaboration there. And we're in conversation with a company that you may be familiar with, Milk Presents. And just really at very, very early stages about whether there's possibilities of some kind of partnership there. So that's really, really early stage conversation. But I think we're very interested in when there are stories that connect with children and young people, really working with companies who bring expertise around those stories, particularly when they are beyond our own realm of experience and expertise. So that kind of sense of authentic lived experiences. And that kind of us being a company that seeks partnerships and collaborates is definitely something that we're looking at, what those collaborations are for the future. And that feels very exciting as well. And how you share your expertise where it might be different. What does that look like in terms of work? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would just like to say, Deborah, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with me today. Thank you for your time. It's much appreciated, and it's been absolutely just brilliant just to catch up with you and hear about all of the fantastic work that you've been doing and that the BLAS continue to do in Leeds and nationally as well. So thank you very much.
No, I've enjoyed it. It's been good. It's been really good. Thank you. And hopefully I haven't rambled on too much and you'll be able to edit it into something coherent. Thank you.